Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya.
It's me. It's me. I'll take both, to be honest. It can be Sonia, it can be Sanya, it can be anything, to be honest. Good morning, Dr. Ruben. Good morning, Ayo. Good morning,
Adefemi Akinsanya.
Anti-Femi.
Hi.
Anti-Femi.
That's my
That's
favorite
your new
title, Anti-Femi.
Anti-Femi.
Thank you for the tennis racket, Rufai.
Oh,
You might regret it when I beat you, but it's okay.
Okay.
Morning to you, viewers. Let me tell you what is happening around the world. Now, US President Donald Trump, he has filed a $10 billion defamation lawsuit against the BBC over an edit of his 6th of January 2021 speech in a Panorama documentary. Now, in this 33-page lawsuit, Donald Trump has accused the broadcaster of defamation and of violating trade practices law after splicing together two entirely separate pieces of his speech on the 6th of January 2021 in order to intentionally misrepresent the meaning of what President Trump said. Though the BBC did apologize to Trump last month, it rejected his demands for compensation back then and disagreed that there was any basis for a defamation claim. Now, the BBC has not yet responded to the news of this lawsuit, which is just recently broken. Now, staying in the United States now, Nick Rayner, the son of renowned director and actor Rob Rayner, has been arrested on suspicion of murder after the shocking death of his parents, Rob and Michelle Rayner, who were found dead in their Los Angeles home on Sunday. Authorities reported that the couple both had stab wounds and they were discovered in the afternoon, while their 32-year-old son, Nick, was taken into custody later that evening. That happened around 9:15 p.m. It is currently, he continues to be held without bail in the custody of the authorities. The Los Angeles police chief did indicate that the case will be referred to prosecutors to determine formal charges. Now, the motivations and specific circumstances surrounding this really tragic incident remain unclear, as no comment has been provided by the Rayner family. Now, Rob Rayner, who is a celebrated figure in Hollywood, directed numerous films, including A Few Good Men, When Harry Met Sally, Stand By Me, and The Princess Bride. Now, his sudden death has left the entertainment industry reeling, mourning a legacy built over decades. Now, in a controversial response, US President Donald Trump did suggest that Rayner's death was politically motivated, citing an alleged Trump derangement syndrome as a contributing factor. This claim clearly has faced backlash across various political circles. Talking of politics, let's go over into Far East Asia. Hong Kong pro-democracy campaigner and media tycoon Jimmy Lai has been found guilty of colluding with foreign forces under the city's controversial NSL. It's the National Security Law. Now, he's 78 years old. He's also a UK citizen, and he has been in jail since December of 2020. He was convicted of conspiring with foreign forces to impose sanctions on Hong Kong and China and publishing seditious material through its now-defunct Apple Daily newspaper. Lai faces life in prison and is expected to be sentenced early next year. Now, the verdict has been welcomed by Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee, who said that Lai's actions damaged the country's interests and the welfare of Hong Kong people. However, rights groups have condemned the verdict as a cruel judicial farce, saying the national security law has been used to crush dissent in Hong Kong. Lai's family and supporters have expressed concern about the deteriorating health, his own health, with his son Sebastian urging the UK government to do more to free his father. The UK has condemned the verdict, saying that Lai has been targeted for peacefully exercising his right to freedom of expression. Well, let's take a look at our newspaper headlines today. Of course, we start with the front page of This Day here in Nigeria. And This Day does lead with news that President Tinubu has mobilized all military and law enforcement assets, announcing the procurement of mine-resistant vehicles, a new armored fleet, and the refurbishment of over 100 armored fighting vehicles to boost the operational readiness of the armed forces. Also on the front page of This Day, there are reports that the federal government is shifting from heavy borrowing to mobilizing mass savings in order to tackle rising debt, with Finance Minister Wale Edun revealing that 70% of the 2025 capital budget will be rolled over to 2026. Let's take a look at the New Telegraph this morning, because the New Telegraph is also talking about assets and savings and all of these things. So the Senate has raised concerns over the overlapping implementation of the 2024 and the 2025 budgets. That's as the 2026 appropriation bill is being prepared. Lawmakers have questioned delayed contractor payments and revenue deployments. They've also called on the FIRS, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, to achieve a 30 trillion naira target for 2026. Essentially, they have set up an ad hoc committee. 3 members are on that committee, and they were established in order to ensure local contractors are paid before the end of the budget cycle. Moving on to our legal insert this week, we've got The Advocate by Onikepo Braithwaite, and this week she delves into this controversy over Mariam Sanders' presidential pardon and how it raises serious concerns about the limits of executive clemency versus the authority of the court. She argues in this column that the prerogative of mercy should not be exercised while judicial proceedings are still pending in order to preserve a separation of powers truly. And she also says that it also helps to continue respect for the rule of law. Well, let's move on to The Nation this morning. The Nation newspaper does report that former President Buhari, Muhammadu Buhari, did avoid naming a successor in the 2022 APC primaries to protect lives and preserve party unity while respecting acting President Osinbajo's, acting Vice President or President's decision to remove the DSS back then. The DSC's Director General Lawal Daura. Now, all of this is coming from this book, The Legacy. Let me get my bearings. All of it is coming from this new book, From Soldier to Statesman, The Legacy of Muhammadu Buhari. And in that book, essentially, it highlights his disciplined approach, his evidence-based approach to governance and security. Also talks about how he prioritized institutional stability over political theatrics. So I can imagine that'd be a very interesting read. Moving on to the leadership this morning, let's take a look at what the leadership have to offer us. I'll move out to shots just quickly. So essentially what we're seeing is that the Nigeria Police Force will resume enforcement of this tinted glass permit from the 2nd of January. They're saying that rising security concerns and increased criminal activities linked to unauthorized tinted vehicles mean that it is time for them to continue taking this issue very seriously. Then to our Daily Independent this morning, the Daily Independent does report, let's take a look at the Daily Independent, there we go. Daily Independent does report that Nigeria's high airfares are being driven, as we've heard many times, by soaring jet fuel costs, dollar-denominated expenses, currency volatility, and rising regulatory charges. Now, you've got Air Peace's Chief Commercial Officer, his name is Noel Ngala, and he warns that essentially thin margins, overseas maintenance, and unstable operating conditions essentially leave very little room to absorb shocks without having to pass costs on to passengers. Well, moving on to The Punch. The Punch does report that Dangote's refinery has slashed prices down, petrol gantry prices from 828 naira to 699 naira per litre. They are forcing thereby importers and private depots to cut prices, with marketers facing losses of over 80 billion naira monthly. This is while Nigerians, of course, are enjoying the cheaper fuel at some 739 naira per litre. The aggressive price war is straining the downstream petroleum sector, though, and prompting intervention by the House of Representatives. Moving on to our foreign papers now, let's take a look at the Daily Express. And there is concerning news there. So farmers in the United Kingdom, they've called on British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer to essentially stop this cruel tax raid on farmers. That's what they're calling it. They're saying that some farmers are threatening to take their own lives before the new tax comes into force in April. And then finally, wrapping things up with our final paper today, we've got The Times, and it does picture the 9 victims in that Bondi terror attack in Australia. All of them, unfortunately, losing their lives. And there's also a quip about Sir Keir Starmer urging doctors to push back against the British Medical Association over planned strikes this week during a serious flu outbreak in the United Kingdom.
A couple of things. I think Trump is just stretching it with this case. The BBC has already apologized. In the case of defamation, once an apology comes in, I think things should soften. But Trump wants to prove a point. I think he's going to have a hard time in court to prove, number one, malice, Number two, some legal experts have talked about, editing a standard operating procedure. Number three, there are many court judgments to the effect that Trump really emboldened the insurrection that happened. In fact, people have been charged to court as a result of this. Yes. So on these three strong grounds, except if there are extraordinary circumstances and information out there that prove that the BBC actually had malice towards Trump intentionally, I think that case should be dismissed at some point.
Yes,
and I think it's very uncharitable for Trump to pee on the dead man's grave. Even if you didn't like the Rainers, please, there's no point tweeting all that. It was so bad that the likes of Piers Morgan, of all people, you can't be as right that Piers Morgan. In fact, he even wrote a book, a bestseller about being anti-woke. Piers Morgan even had to tell him on Twitter that this is terribly bad. You should delete that message you put on Truth Social. And it just shows the way Trump goes. He doesn't care for other people. And that's why the resistance is on. Look at what he's doing with ICE. Look at what he's doing with other institutions of government. By the way, Richard Maudo's got a great new podcast out called The Burn Order on how the Japanese were taken into concentration camps in 1942. I think it's a must listen to for everybody. And you understand what Trump is doing with ICE today. Definitely. This time, too, will pass, like 1942 passed.
Okay, so still on Trump, because I'd like to draw a parallel. But first of all, very sad news with Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle. More detail has emerged as to how they died. Their throats were slit in a very tragic circumstance, in very tragic circumstances. But even worse off is the fact that the main suspect at the time is one of a family member, their middle son, to be exact. It was their daughter who found them dead at home, and she alerted the police and actually mentioned that a family member might have caused the death. But going on to, despite tributes pouring in because of some of the movies you already mentioned that he was a part of, is the president's speech. Jimmy Kimmel has come out to say that where he ought to have shown compassion and leadership, he didn't take the opportunity. Now, what he said might have been very unverified, was that he had caused anger based on his consistent, what he calls Trump derangement syndrome. And that, and he spoke about these things. And I draw the parallel with the time Charlie Kirk died. And recall that the president said that anyone who was found saying anything bad about Charlie Kirk on social media should be deported or denied the US visa, if you remember. He was very intolerant to that. So to imagine him, who was intolerant to people speaking ill about Charlie Kirk, then speaking ill about someone who does not support him, just shows, double standards there. Just to talk about that. But I'm just so sorry about their deaths, and I hope that they say the son has mental challenges. They've often talked about it. They had a public spat just the weekend before that at a public event. He also had issues around drugs, and this just presents a bigger advocacy against abuse of drugs.
Definitely.
Okay, the classical principle establishing folk wisdom from ancient times is do not speak ill of the dead, dramatized to great effect in Sophocles' Greek tragedian Ajax, in a play titled Ajax. But here we see President Trump violating that, and he speaks to his lack of empathy, using the occasion of what is clearly a family tragedy, a son allegedly butchering his own parents, to now say, Rob Reiner was a deranged man, and that, more or less saying he had no pity for him. In other words, he deserves to die. Because he said he was suffering from what he called the Trump derangement syndrome. Reiner having been a very staunch critic of President Trump. No, it's very unfortunate that the President of the United States will speak in that manner against the grain, the run of humanistic response to tragedies. Now, as for Jimmy Lai, what you face in Hong Kong is just media repression, as articulated in the National Security Law that came on stream in 2019 and the Article 23 that followed it. Now, Jimmy Lai was a very strong pro-democracy protester against Hong Kong and China. Now they are using this law, to suppress him and to send him to life in prison.
Yes.
I think Amnesty International is very right to have called it a judicial farce. And Taiwan is also right to say that what we are having here is clearly a case of political persecution. As for the case between Trump and BBC, again, this is the occupational hazard. for journalists. Now, that particular matter led to the resignation of the Director General of BBC, Jim Davey, and also the news director, Turner, who had to resign because of this matter. But we'll see what happens in court. BBC, meanwhile, is saying, we have offered an apology. We do not think that Trump suffered any particular damage to the extent that it did not affect the outcome of the report and that the material was not broadcast in the United States. However, Trump's lawyers say that it was broadcast on VPN, via VPN in the state of Florida, where they have instituted the lawsuit. But it will be interesting to see whether Trump gets that $10 billion that he's asking for on the 2 counts that his lawyers are pushing. Or whether he fails or not will also be ultimately a lesson for journalists, for the media generally, either in Hong Kong or in Britain. This is part of the hazard involving this profession. After all, in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai is facing this suffering because he publishes a paper called Apple Daily, which he uses to criticize the establishment in both Hong Kong and China. So maybe we will also have lessons to learn from that.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Adefemi Akinsanya. We'll see you again tomorrow morning for more updates around the world and, of course, a detailed analysis of the newspaper.